The wind howled against the thin, creaking walls of the small, dimly lit house. Earl sat at the edge of his worn-out recliner, his gnarled fingers clutching an overdue bill, the red, final notice, stamp glaring at him like a silent threat. His eyes, dulled by age and exhaustion, lingered on the stack of envelopes, bills, medical expenses, another month slipping further out of reach. A muffled noise came from the bedroom. Earl's heart clenched. He set the bill down and pushed himself up, his knees protesting with sharp, familiar pain. As he shuffled toward the room, he braced himself for what he would find. Margaret sat on the bed, her frail figure barely a shadow of the woman she once was. She was staring blankly at the far wall, her hands clutching an old wedding photo, her fingers tracing the edges as if trying to remember something just beyond her grasp. Earl's breath hitched. Some days, she recognized him. Most days, she didn't. "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered, forcing warmth into his voice. Margaret didn't answer. Her lips trembled, her cloudy blue eyes distant. Earl knelt beside her, swallowing down the ache in his chest. "It's me, honey. I'm right here." For a moment, there was nothing. Then, so softly it almost broke him, she murmured, "Who are you?" A sharp pain stabbed through Earl's ribs, deeper than any wound time had ever given him. He forced a smile, nodding as if he expected the answer. "It's okay," he said, stroking her thin hand. "I'm just happy you're here." Margaret turned back to the photograph, lost in a world he couldn't reach. Earl closed his eyes, steeling himself. He kissed the top of her silver hair before standing. The day wasn't going to wait for him. The bills weren't going to pay themselves. As he stepped into the kitchen, the silence pressed in like a weight. The coffee pot gurgled, filling the air with the bitter scent of routine. He looked around the small space, faded wallpaper, dishes stacked in the sink, the clock ticking steadily above the counter. The house was a living relic, frozen in time, waiting for something that would never come back. Earl reached for his work vest, the fabric rough beneath his fingertips. He glanced back at the table, at the pile of bills, at the final notice that screamed in blood-red ink. Just one more day, he told himself. Just one more day. The sun had barely begun to rise when he locked the door behind him. The air was crisp, the streets empty. His old sedan coughed to life, the engine sputtering in protest. As he pulled out of the driveway, he didn't see the sleek black motorcycle parked across the street. A man sat on it, motionless. Watching. The parking lot stretched before him, a sea of scattered shopping carts glinting under the early morning sun. Earl pulled into his usual spot near the back, where the pavement cracked from years of neglect. He turned off the ignition and sat still for a moment, rubbing his knee as the dull ache pulsed through his leg. The pain had become an old friend, whispering reminders of time and labor long spent. With a sigh, he grabbed his faded work vest from the passenger seat, slipping it on as he stepped out into the cool air. The store wasn't open yet, but already, the lot buzzed with movement. Employees trickled in, their faces drawn and uninterested. Earl made his way to the cart station, where a tangled mess of metal and plastic waited for him. He flexed his fingers, took a deep breath, and pushed against the first row of carts. The wheels screeched in protest as they began to move, their stubborn resistance a cruel metaphor for his own aging body. Across the lot, a young employee leaned against a lamppost, sipping coffee, eyes fixed on his phone. The manager stood nearby, arms crossed, scanning the area like a man who had never known exhaustion. "Earl." The sharp call cut through the morning stillness. He turned, already knowing what was coming. Why are these carts still all over the place? The manager, a man barely in his 30s, strode toward him with a look of impatience. "I thought you were supposed to be on top of this." Earl straightened, swallowing down the sting of frustration. "I just got here. I'm getting to it." The manager scoffed. "Well, get to it faster. We don't need two people doing your job." Earl nodded, saying nothing. Experience had taught him that words only made things worse. He turned back to the carts, ignoring the throbbing in his knee as he gathered another row, pushing them forward with slow, measured effort. One wheel wobbled, fighting him. Another cart veered off, nearly slamming into a parked car. He caught it just in time, wincing as the motion sent a sharp bolt of pain up his spine. Just one more day. From across the lot, an engine rumbled low and steady. A motorcycle, sleek, black, and powerful, rolled to a stop near the entrance. Keanu Reeves removed his helmet, running a hand through his dark hair as he surveyed the scene before him. He had seen enough. The exhaustion in the old man's movements. The way he bit back his frustration. The way the manager barked orders with the casual cruelty of someone who had never struggled a day in his life. Something about it struck him deep, an ache that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the man pushing those carts. Keanu swung his leg over the bike and adjusted his sunglasses. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked toward Earl. "Need a hand with that?" The voice startled him. Earl turned, frowning slightly as he took in the man standing before him. Something about him was familiar, but the recognition hovered just out of reach. "No, don't worry about it," Earl said, forcing a polite smile. "I've got it under control." Keanu studied him for a moment before nodding. "I believe you. But I insist." Before Earl could protest, Keanu was already gripping the row of carts, effortlessly maneuvering them into place. Earl blinked. "You really don't have to do that." Keanu shot him a grin. "I know. But sometimes, even the strongest need a helping hand." For a moment, Earl didn't respond. He wasn't used to kindness, not like this. But there was something about the man's presence, calm, steady, unwavering, that made him nod in reluctant acceptance. "Well, if you really want to help, start with those over there," Earl said, pointing to another scattered row of carts. Keanu nodded like he'd just been given a mission and got to work. They moved in unison, the morning sun climbing higher as they worked side by side. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt natural, two men bound not by words but by an unspoken understanding. After a while, Keanu spoke. "How long have you been doing this?" Earl exhaled, shifting his weight as he leaned on the handle of a cart. "A few years now. Ever since my wife got sick. Needed the money to keep up with the bills." Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "She's lucky to have you." Earl chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know about lucky. But I made a promise to take care of her. That's what matters." Keanu considered that for a moment. He could see it, the quiet devotion, the sacrifices made without question. It was the kind of love that people wrote stories about. They continued working, the rhythm of carts clanking together filling the air. "So," Keanu said, after a moment. "Have you ever thought about retiring?" Earl let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Retire? With what money? I sold almost everything I had for Margaret's treatment. What's left barely covers the bills." Keanu frowned, gripping the handle of a cart a little tighter. "That's not right." Earl shrugged. "It's life." Keanu fell silent, his thoughts swirling. He had met all kinds of people, lived through all kinds of stories. But there was something about Earl, something raw and real, that sat heavy in his chest. As they finished the last row of carts, Keanu dusted his hands off. "Let's grab a coffee," he said. "My treat." Earl hesitated, then nodded. He was tired, and his throat was dry. A cup of coffee didn't sound too bad. They walked to a small cafe inside the store, Keanu ordering 2 cups without asking what Earl wanted. They sat on a bench outside, watching the morning rush unfold in front of them. Keanu took a sip, then glanced at Earl. "You ever ask for help?" Earl's fingers tightened around his cup. Most people have their own problems. I can't expect them to carry mine. Keanu nodded slowly. Pride gets in the way, doesn't it? Earl exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I've always believed a man should solve his own problems. Keanu smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. You're not wrong. But sometimes, letting someone help is the bravest thing you can do. For the first time in a long time, Earl didn't know how to respond. Keanu set his coffee down, studying the old man beside him. He had already made up his mind. Earl might not ask for help, but that didn't mean he didn't deserve it. Keanu Reeves was about to change this man's life. Earl just didn't know it yet. The coffee in Earl's hands had gone lukewarm, but he barely noticed. He sat still, staring into the dark liquid as if it held answers to questions he had long stopped asking. Across from him, Keanu leaned back on the bench, his gaze steady, unreadable behind his sunglasses. The morning rush had settled into a steady hum of customers moving in and out of the store, but neither man seemed in a hurry to move. Keanu took another sip of his coffee, then broke the silence. So, how long have you and Margaret been together? Earl exhaled, his fingers tightening around the cup. 62 years. The words came with a weight, a lifetime packed into a single sentence. Keanu nodded, as if he could feel the years in the answer. That's a long time. Earl gave a tired chuckle. Long enough to know that no matter how hard life gets, you don't turn your back on the people you love. Keanu watched him carefully. And how is she now? For a moment, Earl didn't answer. He stared at his hands, rough and worn, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter. Some days, she remembers me. Most days, she doesn't. He looked up, his eyes clouded with something heavy. But even if she forgets me, I won't forget her. Keanu let the words settle between them, the weight of them pressing into the space like an unspoken truth. He set his coffee down, leaning forward slightly. You take care of her by yourself? Earl nodded. I have to. There's no one else. Used to have a little help, but money ran out. So I do what I can. Keanu studied him. And the job? It's enough. Earl let out a breath, shaking his head. Barely. I sold our house to pay for her treatment. Sold the car. Sold just about everything. We moved into a small place, nothing fancy, but it's home. His lips pressed into a thin line. I work because if I don't, she doesn't get what she needs. And I can't let that happen. Keanu sat back, his jaw tight. He had seen struggle before, met people with hardships carved into their skin like battle scars. But this was different. This was a man who had given everything, asked for nothing, and still kept going. Earl must have noticed the look on his face because he offered a small, wry smile. Don't look at me like that, kid. I don't need pity. Keanu let out a soft chuckle. Trust me, that's not what I'm thinking. Earl studied him, then nodded. Good. Because I don't regret a damn thing. Keanu swirled the coffee in his cup, something unreadable flashing across his face. You ever think about stopping? Earl gave a short laugh, shaking his head. And do what? Sit around, waiting for the world to move on without me? He exhaled, glancing at the people coming and going through the store doors. I don't have that luxury. Keanu was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. If someone could take some of that weight off your shoulders, just a little, would you let them? Earl frowned slightly. I appreciate the conversation, son, but I've been doing this a long time. No one's coming to save me. Keanu tilted his head, considering him. Maybe you don't need saving. But even the strongest men deserve a break. Earl didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands again, as if searching for something in the wrinkles and calluses. A break, he murmured, almost like he had forgotten what the word meant. Keanu watched him for another second, then stood. "Well, I should get going." Earl blinked up at him, surprised by the sudden shift. "That so?" Keanu nodded, tossing his empty coffee cup into the trash. "But I'll see you around." Earl squinted at him. "You come here often?" Keanu smiled. "Maybe I will." Without another word, he turned and walked toward his motorcycle. Earl watched him go, still trying to figure the man out. There was something about him, something that felt unfinished. As Keanu swung his leg over the bike and slid on his helmet, he cast one last glance at Earl, who was still sitting on the bench, lost in thought. Keanu revved the engine once, then pulled out of the parking lot, disappearing down the road. Earl sat there for a moment longer before sighing and pushing himself up from the bench. His break was over. He had work to do. But something about that conversation stayed with him, lingering like an echo he couldn't shake. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change. Keanu didn't go home that night. Not right away. Instead, he found himself driving through the quiet streets, the weight of Earl's words pressing against his chest. The old man's voice lingered in his head, rough and tired, carrying the kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical, it was the exhaustion of a man who had given everything and had nothing left to give. Keanu had met plenty of people in his life. Some rich, some struggling, some broken, some whole. But there was something about Earl that felt different. It wasn't just that he was working himself to the bone for his wife. It was the quiet dignity with which he carried it all, the unwavering commitment to someone who, on most days, didn't even remember his name. That kind of love, it was rare. And Keanu wasn't about to walk away from it. The next morning, as the sun spilled over the horizon, Keanu Reeves walked into the grocery store, not as a customer, but with a purpose. He went straight to the manager's office, ignoring the curious stares of employees who recognized him. The manager, the same man who had barked at Earl the day before, looked up in confusion when Keanu stepped inside. "Mr. Reeves?" His voice carried the kind of nervousness that came from not knowing why a celebrity had just walked into his office. Keanu sat down across from him, calm but firm. "I need to talk to you about Earl." The manager blinked, caught off guard. "Earl? The cart guy?" Keanu's jaw tightened. "The man who works harder than anyone here." The manager hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "What about him?" Keanu slid a check across the desk. The manager's eyes flickered down, then widened as he saw the number written on it. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. "I want this to cover his pay for the next 6 months, Keanu said. "No deductions. No taxes. Just straight into his pocket." The manager stared at the check, then looked back up. "That's generous. But he'd never accept it." Keanu nodded. "That's why he can't know it's from me." The manager ran a hand over his mouth, thinking. "So what do I tell him?" Keanu leaned forward. "Tell him it's a bonus. Something from the company. Just make sure he takes it." The manager hesitated. "And if he asks questions?" Keanu held his gaze. "Then lie." For a moment, the office was silent. Then, slowly, the manager nodded. "All right. I can make that happen." Keanu sat back, satisfied. "Good. One more thing, where does he get his wife's medication?" The manager blinked. There's a pharmacy a few blocks from here. I think he picks up her prescriptions every month." Keanu stood. "Then I have one more stop to make." An hour later, Keanu was at the pharmacy, speaking to the owner behind the counter. He didn't bother with explanations. He simply pulled out his credit card and said, "Whatever prescriptions Margaret Lawson needs, put them on this. For as long as she needs them." The pharmacist gaped at him. "Sir, that could be thousands of." "I don't care," Keanu interrupted. Just make sure she never misses a dose. The pharmacist hesitated, then slowly nodded, swiping the card. Keanu signed the receipt without a second glance, then turned and walked out. By the time he got back to the grocery store parking lot, Earl was already out there, pushing another row of carts, his face drawn with the same exhaustion Keanu had seen the day before. He watched him for a moment, then grabbed 2 coffees from the cafe inside and made his way over. Earl looked up as Keanu approached. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, taking the coffee Keanu handed him. Keanu smirked. "I told you I'd be around." Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who hangs around grocery store parking lots." Keanu took a sip of his coffee. "You'd be surprised." They sat on the same bench as before, the morning air cool around them. Earl exhaled, watching a mother wrestle her toddler into a car seat a few rows away. "You know," he said after a moment, "it's been a long time since I had someone to talk to like this." Keanu nodded. "Maybe you should get used to it." Earl smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Nah. People come and go. That's life." Keanu studied him for a second. "Not everyone." Earl glanced at him, something unreadable in his gaze. "You're a strange guy, Keanu." Keanu grinned. "I get that a lot." Their conversation was cut short when the manager appeared at the store entrance, looking around. When his eyes landed on Earl, he lifted a hand and motioned for him to come inside. Earl frowned. "That's never a good sign." Keanu shrugged. "Maybe today's different." Earl stood, groaning slightly as his knees protested the movement. He gave Keanu a nod. "Guess I'll see you later." Keanu lifted his coffee in a silent toast. "Count on it." As Earl walked toward the store, Keanu stayed where he was, watching. He didn't need to see what happened next. He already knew. Inside the manager's office, Earl stood stiffly as the younger man pushed an envelope across the desk. "What's this?" Earl asked warily. The manager cleared his throat. "A bonus." Earl frowned. "A what?" "A bonus," the manager repeated, avoiding eye contact. "Company policy. For, long-term employees." Earl's eyes narrowed. "Since when?" The manager shrugged, playing it off. "Since now, I guess." Earl slowly picked up the envelope, fingers trembling as he opened it. His breath caught in his throat. Inside was more money than he had seen in years. His heart pounded. This can't be right." The manager forced a tight smile. "It's right. Just take it, Earl. You deserve it." Earl's hands shook as he folded the envelope, swallowing against the lump in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than exhaustion. He felt relief. And outside, Keanu sat on the bench, drinking his coffee, pretending he wasn't waiting for the moment when Earl stepped out of that office, changed forever. Earl stepped out of the manager's office, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. His mind swam, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. The weight of the bills, the years of worry, the constant battle to keep Margaret comfortable, it had all settled into his bones, worn him down to something unrecognizable. And now, suddenly, it felt like someone had lifted 100 pounds off his shoulders. He walked slowly, barely hearing the hum of the grocery store around him. His fingers trembled as he opened the envelope again, just to make sure it was real. It was. The money was there, crisp bills that didn't feel like they belonged in his hands. A bonus, the manager had said. A thank you for his hard work. Earl wasn't a fool. He had been working this job for years. No one had ever handed him anything other than a paycheck barely worth the ink it was printed on. No one had ever looked at him twice, let alone thought he deserved something extra. So why now? He turned toward the parking lot, scanning the rows of cars, the people coming and going. His eyes landed on the bench near the entrance. Keanu was gone. Earl swallowed hard. Something told him this wasn't just company policy. By the time he made it home, the sun was dipping below the horizon, washing the sky in deep oranges and purples. He parked in the driveway, sitting in the silence of his old sedan for a long moment before he reached for the envelope again. It still didn't feel real. Inside the house, Margaret sat in her chair, the same way she did every evening, staring at nothing in particular. A soft lamp bathed the living room in warm light. The walls, covered in old photographs, told stories she could no longer remember. Earl knelt beside her, taking her hands gently in his. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Something happened today. Something good." She blinked, her gaze drifting down to his face. For a split second, something flickered in her cloudy blue eyes, something that sent a shock through his chest. Recognition. "Earl." Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if the name belonged to him or to someone she had once known in another lifetime. Earl's breath caught. It had been weeks since she had said his name. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured, squeezing her hands. She stared at him for a long moment, then down at the photograph in her lap. It was their wedding photo, the edges worn from years of handling. You were always here," she said, her lips curling into the smallest, most delicate smile. Earl felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. "Yeah, honey. I was." Margaret reached up, her frail fingers brushing against his cheek. "You look tired." Earl let out a shaky chuckle, pressing his forehead against her knuckles. "I am, sweetheart. But tonight feels different." She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if she were piecing together a puzzle that had been lost for too long. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she whispered, "Dance with me." Earl's heart clenched. It had been decades since they had danced. Still, he pushed himself up, holding out his hand. Margaret placed hers in his, and though her movements were slow, she stood. He guided her gently to the middle of the living room, where the record player sat untouched in the corner. With trembling fingers, he lowered the needle onto the vinyl. A soft crackle filled the room before the melody of their wedding song drifted through the air. Margaret let out a breath, her smile widening. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Earl held his wife close and swayed with her beneath the golden glow of the lamp. For those few minutes, the world outside disappeared. There was no sickness, no exhaustion, no unpaid bills or long hours pushing carts. There was only them, two kids in love again, wrapped in a song that time couldn't take away. When the music ended, Margaret leaned her head against his chest. "I remember this," she whispered. Earl shut his eyes. "So do I." The moment was fleeting. He knew that. He could feel it slipping away even as he held her. By morning, she wouldn't remember. But he would. And that was enough. Across town, Keanu sat on his motorcycle, parked just outside the small pharmacy. The owner had just finished explaining that Margaret Lawson's prescriptions had been covered in full, indefinitely. Keanu nodded, slipping his sunglasses on as he swung a leg over the bike. He didn't need to see Earl's reaction. He didn't need a thank you, or even for the old man to know what he had done. That wasn't why he did it. As he revved the engine, the cool night air brushed against his face, carrying with it the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, at least for now, one man didn't have to carry so much weight alone. Some people spent their whole lives looking for ways to change the world. Others just found one person and changed theirs. Keanu smiled to himself as he pulled onto the road. That was enough.